The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 3, Side 1. It is not logic that we need, says Shankara, it is insight, the faculty, akin to art, of grasping at once the essential out of the irrelevant, the eternal out of the temporal, the whole out of the part. This is the first prerequisite to philosophy. The second is a willingness to observe, inquire, and think for understanding's sake, not for the sake of invention, wealth, or power. It is a withdrawal of the spirit from all the excitement, bias, and fruits of action. Thirdly, the philosopher must acquire self-restraint, patience, and tranquility. He must learn to live above physical temptation or material concerns. Finally, there must burn deep in his soul the desire for moksha, for liberation from ignorance, for an end to all consciousness of a separate self, for a blissful absorption in the Brahman of complete understanding and infinite unity. In a word, the student needs not the logic of reason so much as a cleansing and deepening discipline of the soul. This, perhaps, has been the secret of all profound education. Shankara establishes the source of his philosophy at a remote and subtle point never quite clearly visioned again until, 1,000 years later, Immanuel Kant wrote his Critique of Pure Reason. How, he asks, is knowledge possible? Apparently, all our knowledge comes from the senses, and reveals not the external reality itself, but our sensory adaptation, perhaps transformation of that reality. By sense, then, we can never quite know the real. We can know it only in that garb of space, time, and cause, which may be a web created by our organs of sense and understanding, designed or evolved to catch and hold that fluent and elusive reality whose existence we can surmise, but whose character we can never objectively describe. Our way of perceiving will forever be inextricably mingled with the thing perceived. This is not the airy subjectivism of the solipsist who thinks that he can destroy the world by going to sleep. The world exists, but it is maya, not delusion, but phenomenon, an appearance created partly by our thought. Our incapacity to perceive things except through the film of space and time, or to think of them except in terms of cause and change, is an innate limitation, an avidya, or ignorance, which is bound up with the very mode of perception, and to which, therefore, all flesh is heir. Maya and avidya are the subjective and objective sides of the great illusion by which the intellect supposes that it knows the real. It is through maya and avidya, through our birthright of ignorance, that we see a multiplicity of objects and a flux of change. In truth, there is only one being, and change is a mere name for the superficial fluctuations of forms. Behind the maya or veil of change in things, to be reached not by sensation or intellect, but only by the insight and intuition of the trained spirit, is the one universal reality, Brahman. This natural obscuration of sense and intellect by the organs and forms of sensation and understanding bars us likewise from perceiving the one unchanging soul that stands beneath all individual souls and minds. Our separate selves, visible to perception and thought, are as unreal as the phantasmagoria of space and time. Individual differences and distinct personalities are bound up with body and matter. They belong to the kaleidoscopic world of change, and these merely phenomenal selves will pass away with the material conditions of which they are a part. But the underlying life which we feel in ourselves when we forget space and time, cause and change, is the very essence and reality of us, that Atman which we share with all selves and things, and which, undivided and omnipresent, is identical with Brahman, God. But what is God? Just as there are two selves, the ego and the Atman, and two worlds, the phenomenal and the noumenal, so there are two deities, an Ishvara, or creator, worshipped by the people through the patterns of space, cause, time, and change, and a Brahman, or pure being, worshipped by that philosophical piety which seeks and finds, behind all separate things and selves, one universal reality, unchanging amid all changes, indivisible amid all divisions, eternal despite all vicissitudes of form, all birth and death. Polytheism, even theism, belongs to the world of maya and avidya. They are forms of worship that correspond to the forms of perception and thought. They are as necessary to our moral life as space, time, and cause are necessary to our intellectual life, but they have no absolute validity or objective truth. To Shankara, the existence of God is no problem, for he defines God as existence, and identifies all real being with God. But of the existence of a personal God, creator or redeemer, there may, he thinks, be some question. Such a deity, says this pre-plagiarist of Kant, cannot be proved by reason. He can only be postulated as a practical necessity, offering peace to our limited intellects and encouragement to our fragile morality. The philosopher, though he may worship in every temple and bow to every god, will pass beyond these forgivable forms of popular faith. Feeling the illusoriness of plurality and the monistic unity of all things, he will adore as the supreme being, being itself, indescribable, limitless, spaceless, timeless, causeless, changeless being, the source and substance of all reality. We may apply the adjectives conscious, intelligent, even happy to Brahman, since Brahman includes all selves, and these may have such qualities. But all other adjectives would be applicable to Brahman equally, since it includes all qualities of all things. Essentially, Brahman is neuter, raised above personality and gender, beyond good and evil, above all moral distinctions, all differences and attributes, all desires and ends. Brahman is the cause and effect, the timeless and secret essence of the world. The goal of philosophy is to find that secret and to lose the seeker in the secret found. To be one with God means for Shankara to rise above, or to sink beneath, the separateness and brevity of the self, with all its narrow purposes and interests, to become unconscious of all parts, divisions, things, to be placidly at one in a desireless nirvana with that great ocean of being in which there are no warring purposes, no competing selves, no parts, no change, no space, and no time. To find this blissful peace, Ananda, a man must renounce not merely the world but himself. He must care nothing for possessions or goods, even for good or evil. He must look upon suffering and death as Maya, surface incidents of body and matter, time and change, and he must not think of his own personal quality and fate. A single moment of self-interest or pride can destroy all his liberation. Good works cannot give a man salvation, for good works have no validity or meaning except in the Maya world of space and time. Only the knowledge of the saintly seer can bring that salvation which is the recognition of the identity of self and the universe, Atman and Brahman, soul and God, and the absorption of the part in the whole. Only when this absorption is complete does the wheel of reincarnation stop, for then it is seen that the separate self and personality to which reincarnation comes is an illusion. It is Ishvara, the Maya god, that gives rebirth to the self in punishment and reward. But when the identity of Atman and Brahman has become known, then, says Shankara, the soul's existence as wanderer and Brahman's existence as creator, that is, as Ishvara, have vanished away. Ishvara and karma, like things in selves, belong to the exoteric doctrine of Vedanta as adapted to the needs of the common man. In the esoteric or secret doctrine, soul and Brahman are one, never wandering, never dying, never changed. It is thoughtful of Shankara to confine his esoteric doctrine to philosophers, for as Voltaire believed that only a society of philosophers could survive without laws, so only a society of supermen could live beyond good and evil. Critics have complained that if good and evil are Maya, part of the unreal world, then all moral distinctions fall away and devils are as good as saints. But these moral distinctions, Shankara cleverly replies, are real within the world of space and time, and are binding for those who live in the world. They are not binding upon the soul that has united itself with Brahman. Such a soul can do no wrong, since wrong implies desire and action, and the liberated soul by definition does not move in the sphere of desire and self-considering action. Whoever consciously injures another lives on the plane of Maya, and is subject to its distinctions, its morals, and its laws. Only the philosopher is free, only wisdom is liberty. It was a subtle and profound philosophy to be written by a lad in his 20s. Shankara not only elaborated it in writing and defended it successfully in debate, but he expressed snatches of it in some of the most sensitive religious poetry of India. When all challenges had been met, he retired to a hermitage in the Himalayas, and according to Hindu tradition died at the age of 32. 10 religious orders were founded in his name, and many disciples accepted and developed his philosophy. One of them, some say Shankara himself, wrote for the people a popular exposition of the Vedanta, the Mohammadgara, or Hammer of Folly, in which the essentials of the system were summed up with clarity and force. Fool, give up thy thirst for wealth, banish all desires from thy heart. Let thy mind be satisfied with what is gained by thy karma. Do not be proud of wealth, of friends, or of youth. Time takes away all in a moment. Leaving quickly all this which is full of illusion, enter into the place of Brahman. Life is tremulous, like a water drop on a lotus leaf. Time is playing, life is waning, yet the breath of hope never ceases. The body is wrinkled, the hair gray, the mouth has become toothless, the stick in the hand shakes, yet man leaves not the anchor of hope. Preserve equanimity always. In thee, in me, and in others there dwells Vishnu alone. It is useless to be angry with me or impatient. See every self in self, and give up all thought of difference. 3. The conclusions of Hindu philosophy: decadence, summary, criticism, influence. The Mohammedan invasions put an end to the great age of Hindu philosophy. The assaults of the Moslems and later of the Christians upon the native faith drove it for self-defense into a timid unity that made treason of all debate and stifled creative heresy in a stagnant uniformity of thought. By the 12th century, the system of the Vedanta, which in Shankara had tried to be a religion for philosophers, was reinterpreted by such saints as Ramanuja, circa 1050, into an orthodox worship of Vishnu, Rama, and Krishna. Forbidden to think new thoughts, philosophy became not only scholastic but barren. It accepted its dogmas from the priesthood and proved them laboriously by distinctions without difference and logic without reason. Nevertheless, the Brahmins, in the solitude of their retreats and under the protection of their unintelligibility, preserved the old systems carefully in esoteric sutras and commentaries, and transmitted across generations and centuries the conclusions of Hindu philosophy. In all these systems, Brahmanical or other, the categories of the intellect are represented as helpless or deceptive before a reality immediately felt or seen. And all our 18th century rationalism appears to the Indian metaphysician as a vain and superficial attempt to subject the incalculable universe to the concepts of a saloniere. Into blind darkness pass they who worship ignorance, into still greater darkness they who are content with knowledge. Hindu philosophy begins where European philosophy ends, with an inquiry into the nature of knowledge and the limitations of reason. It starts not with the physics of Thales and Democritus, but with the epistemology of Locke and Kant. It takes mind as that which is most immediately known, and therefore refuses to resolve it into a matter known only mediately and through mind. It accepts an external world, but does not believe that our senses can ever know it as it is. All science is a charted ignorance and belongs to Maya. It formulates in ever-changing concepts and phrases the rationale of a world in which reason is but a part, one shifting current in an interminable sea. Even the person that reasons is Maya, illusion. What is he but a temporary conjunction of events, a passing node in the curves of matter and mind through space and time? For what are his acts or his thoughts but the fulfillment of forces far antedating his birth? Nothing is real but Brahman, that vast ocean of being in which every form is a moment's wave or a fleck of froth on the wave. Virtue is not the quiet heroism of good works, nor any pious ecstasy. It is simply the recognition of the identity of the self with every other self in Brahman. Morality is such living as comes from a sense of union with all things. He who discerns all creatures in his self and his self in all creatures has no disquiet thence. What delusion, what grief can he with him? Certain characteristic qualities which would not seem to be defects from the Hindu point of view have kept this philosophy from exercising a wider influence in other civilizations. Its method, its scholastic terminology, and its Vedic assumptions handicap it in finding sympathy among nations with other assumptions or more secularized cultures. Its doctrine of Maya gives little encouragement to morality or active virtue. Its pessimism is a confession that it has not, despite the theory of karma, explained evil, and part of the effect of these systems has been to exalt a stagnant quietism in the face of evils that might conceivably have been corrected, or of work that cried out to be done. Nonetheless, there is a depth in these meditations which, by comparison, casts an air of superficiality upon the activistic philosophies generated in more invigorating zones. Perhaps our Western systems, so confident that knowledge is power, are the voices of a once lusty youth exaggerating human ability and tenure. As our energies tire in the daily struggle against impartial nature and hostile time, we look with more tolerance upon Oriental philosophies of surrender and peace. Hence the influence of Indian thought upon other cultures has been greatest in the days of their weakening or decay. While Greece was winning victories, she paid little attention to Pythagoras or Parmenides. When Greece was declining, Plato and the Orphic priests took up the doctrine of reincarnation, while Zeno the Oriental preached an almost Hindu fatalism and resignation. And when Greece was dying, the Neo-Platonists and the Gnostics drank deep at Indian wells. The impoverishment of Europe by the fall of Rome and the Moslem conquest of the routes between Europe and India seemed to have obstructed for a millennium the direct interchange of Oriental and Occidental ideas. But hardly had the British established themselves in India before editions and translations of the Upanishads began to stir Western thought. Fichte conceived an idealism strangely like Shankara's. Schopenhauer almost incorporated Buddhism, the Upanishads and the Vedanta into his philosophy, and Schelling, in his old age, thought the Upanishads the maturest wisdom of mankind. Nietzsche had dwelt too long with Bismarck and the Greeks to care for India, but in the end he valued above all other ideas his haunting notion of eternal recurrence, a variant of reincarnation. In our time, Europe borrows more and more from the philosophy of the East. Compare Bergson, Kaiserling, Christian Science, Theosophy, while the East borrows more and more from the science of the West. Another world war might leave Europe open again, as the breakup of Alexander's empire opened Greece and the fall of the Roman Republic opened Rome, to an influx of Oriental philosophies and faiths. The mounting insurrection of the Orient against the Occident, the loss of those Asiatic markets that have sustained the industry and prosperity of the West, the weakening of Europe by poverty, faction, and revolution, might make that divided continent ripe for a new religion of celestial hope and earthly despair. Probably it is prejudice that makes such a denouement seem inconceivable in America. Quietism and resignation do not comport with our electric atmosphere, or with the vitality born of rich resources and a spacious terrain. Doubtless our weather will protect us in the end. Chapter 20. The Literature of India. 1. The Languages of India. Sanskrit, the Vernaculars, Grammar. Just as the philosophy and much of the literature of medieval Europe were composed in a dead language unintelligible to the people, so the philosophy and classic literature of India were written in a Sanskrit that had long since passed out of common parlance, but had survived as the Esperanto of scholars having no other common tongue. Divorced from contact with the life of the nation, this literary language became a model of scholasticism and refinement. New words were formed not only by the spontaneous creations of the people, but by the needs of technical discourse in the schools, until at last the Sanskrit of philosophy lost the virile simplicity of the Vedic hymns and became an artificial monster whose sesquipedalia verba crawled like monstrous tapeworms across the page. Meanwhile, the people of northern India, about the 5th century before Christ, had transformed Sanskrit into Prakrit, very much as Italy was to change Latin into Italian. Prakrit became for a time the language of Buddhists and Jains, until it in turn was developed into Pali, the language of the oldest extant Buddhist literature. By the end of the 10th century of our era, these Middle Indian languages had given birth to various vernaculars, of which the chief was Hindi. In the 12th century, this in turn generated Hindustani as the language of the northern half of India. Finally, the invading Muslims filled Hindustani with Persian words, thereby creating a new dialect, Urdu. All these were Indo-Germanic tongues, confined to Hindustan. The Deccan kept its old Dravidian languages, Tamil, Telugu, Kannarese, and Malayalam, and Tamil became the chief literary vehicle of the South. In the 19th century, Bengali replaced Sanskrit as the literary language of Bengal. The novelist Chatterjee was its Boccaccio. The poet Tagore was its Petrarch. Even today, India has 100 languages, and the literature of Swaraj, the movement for self-rule, uses the speech of the conquerors. At a very early date, India began to trace the roots history, relations, and combinations of words. By the 4th century B.C., she had created for herself the science of grammar, and produced probably the greatest of all known grammarians, Panini. The studies of Panini, Patanjali, circa 150 A.D., and Bhartrihari, circa 650, laid the foundations of philology, and that fascinating science of verbal genetics owed almost its life in modern times to the rediscovery of Sanskrit. Writing, as we have seen, was not popular in Vedic India. About the 5th century B.C., the Kharoshthi script was adapted from Semitic models, and in the epics and the Buddhist literature we begin to hear of clerks. Palm leaves and bark served as writing material, and an iron stylus as a pen. The bark was treated to make it less fragile. The pen scratched letters into it, ink was smeared over the bark, and remained in the scratches when the rest of it was wiped away. Paper was brought in by the Moslems, circa 1000 A.D., but did not finally replace bark till the 17th century. The bark pages were kept in order by stringing them upon a cord, and books of such leaves were gathered in libraries which the Hindus termed treasure houses of the goddess of speech. Immense collections of this wooden literature have survived the devastations of time and war. Of printing there is no sign till the 19th century, possibly because, as in China, the adjustment of movable type to the native scripts was too expensive, possibly because printing was looked upon as a vulgar descent from the art of calligraphy. The printing of newspapers and books was brought by the English to the Hindus, who bettered the instruction. Today there are 1,517 newspapers in India, 3,627 periodicals, and over 17,000 new books published in an average year. 2. Education, schools, methods, universities, Muslim education, an emperor on education. Writing continued even to the 19th century to play a very small part in Indian education. Perhaps it was not to the interest of the priests that the sacred or scholastic texts should become an open secret to all. As far as we can trace Indian history, we find a system of education, always in the hands of the clergy, open at first only to the sons of Brahmins, then spreading its privileges from caste to caste until in our time it excludes only the untouchables. Every Hindu village had its schoolmaster, supported out of the public funds. In Bengal alone, before the coming of the British, there were some 80,000 native schools, 1 to every 400 population. The percentage of literacy under Ashoka was apparently higher than in India today. Children went to the village school from September to February, entering at the age of 5 and leaving at the age of 8. Instruction was chiefly of a religious character, no matter what the subject. Rote memorizing was the usual method, and the Vedas were the inevitable text. The 3 R's were included, but were not the main business of education. Character was rated above intellect, and discipline was the essence of schooling. We do not hear of flogging or of other severe measures, but we find that stress was laid above all upon the formation of wholesome and proper habits of life. At the age of 8, the pupil passed to the more formal care of a guru, or personal teacher and guide, with whom the student was to live, preferably till he was 20. Services, sometimes menial, were required of him, and he was pledged to continence, modesty, cleanliness, and a meatless diet. Instruction was now given him in the 5 shastras, or sciences: grammar, arts and crafts, medicine, logic, and philosophy. Finally, he was sent out into the world with the wise admonition that education came only 1/4 from the teacher, 1/4 from private study, 1/4 from one's fellows, and 1/4 from life. From his guru, the student might pass, about the age of 16, to one of the great universities that were the glory of ancient and medieval India: Benares, Taxila, Vidarbha, Ajanta, Ujjain, or Nalanda. Benares was the stronghold of orthodox Brahman learning in Buddha's days as in ours. Taxila, at the time of Alexander's invasion, was known to all Asia as the leading seat of Hindu scholarship, renowned above all for its medical school. Ujjain was held in high repute for astronomy, Ajanta for the teaching of art. The facade of one of the ruined buildings at Ajanta suggests the magnificence of these old universities. Nalanda, most famous of Buddhist institutions for higher learning, had been founded shortly after the master's death, and the state had assigned for its support the revenues of 100 villages. It had 10,000 students, 100 lecture rooms, great libraries, and 6 immense blocks of dormitories, 4 stories high. Its observatories, said Yuan Chuang, were lost in the vapors of the morning, and the upper rooms towered above the clouds. The old Chinese pilgrim loved the learned monks and shady groves of Nalanda so well that he stayed there for 5 years. Of those from abroad who wished to enter the schools of discussion at Nalanda, he tells us, the majority, beaten by the difficulties of the problem, withdrew, and those who were deeply versed in old and modern learning were admitted, only 2 or 3 out of 10 succeeding. The candidates who were fortunate enough to gain admission were given free tuition, board, and lodging, but they were subjected to an almost monastic discipline. Students were not permitted to talk to a woman or to see one. Even the desire to look upon a woman was held a great sin, in the fashion of the hardest saying in the New Testament. The student guilty of sex relations had to wear for a whole year the skin of an ass, with the tail turned upward, and had to go about begging alms and declaring his sin. Every morning the entire student body was required to bathe in the 10 great swimming pools that belonged to the university. The course of study lasted for 12 years, but some students stayed 30 years, and some remained till death. The Mohammedans destroyed nearly all the monasteries, Buddhist or Brahman, in northern India. Nalanda was burned to the ground in 1197, and all its monks were slaughtered. We can never estimate the abundant life of ancient India from what these fanatics spared. Nevertheless, the destroyers were not barbarians. They had a taste for beauty and an almost modern skill in using piety for the purposes of plunder. When the Moguls ascended the throne, they brought a high but narrow standard of culture with them. They loved letters as much as the sword, and knew how to combine a successful siege with poetry. Among the Moslems, education was mostly individual, through tutors engaged by prosperous fathers for their sons. It was an aristocratic conception of education as an ornament, occasionally an aid to a man of affairs and power, but usually an irritant and a public danger in one doomed to poverty or modest place. What the methods of the tutors were, we may judge from one of the great letters of history, the reply of Aurangzeb to his former teacher, who was seeking some sinecure and emolument from the king. "What is it you would have of me, doctor? Can you reasonably desire that I should make you one of the chief omrahs of my court? Let me tell you, if you had instructed me as you should have done, nothing would be more just. For I am of this persuasion, that a child well educated and instructed is as much at least obliged to his master as to his father. But where are those good documents you have given me? In the first place, you have taught me that all Frangistan, so it seems they call Europe, was nothing but I know not what little island, of which the greatest king was he of Portugal, and next to him he of Holland, and after him he of England. And as to the other kings, as those of France and Andalusia, you have represented them to me as our petty rajas, telling me that the kings of Indostan were far above them altogether, that they, the kings of Indostan, were the great ones, the conquerors and kings of the world, and those of Persia and Uzbek, Kashgar, Tartary and Cathay, Pegu, China, and Machina, did tremble at the name of the kings of Indostan. Admirable geography! You should rather have taught me to exactly distinguish all those states of the world and well to understand their strength, their way of fighting, their customs, religions, governments, and interests, and by the pursuit of solid history, to observe their rise, progress, decay, and whence, how, and by what accidents and errors those great changes and revolutions of empires and kingdoms have happened. I have scarce learned of you the name of my grandsires, the famous founders of this empire. So far were you from having taught me the history of their life and what course they took to make such great conquest. You had a mind to teach me the Arabian tongue, to read and to write. I am much obliged, forsooth, for having made me lose so much time upon a language that requires 10 or 12 years to attain to its perfection, as if the son of a king should think it to be an honor to him to be a grammarian or some doctor of the law, and to learn other languages than of his neighbors when he can well be without them. He to whom time is so precious for so many weighty things, which he ought by times to learn. As if there were any spirit that did not with some reluctancy, and even with a kind of debasement, employ itself in so sad and dry an exercise, so longsome and tedious, as is that of learning words. Thus, says the contemporary Bernier, did Aurangzeb resent the pedantic instructions of his tutors, to which 'tis affirmed in that court that he added the following reproof. Know you not that childhood well governed, being a state which is ordinarily accompanied with an happy memory, is capable of thousands of good precepts and instructions, which remain deeply impressed the whole remainder of a man's life and keep the mind always raised for great actions? The law, prayers, and sciences, may they not as well be learned in our mother tongue as in Arabic? You told my father Shah Jahan that you would teach me philosophy. 'Tis true, I remember very well that you have entertained me for many years with airy questions of things that afford no satisfaction at all to the mind, and are of no use in humane society, empty notions and mere fancies, that have only this in them, that they are very hard to understand and very easy to forget. I still remember that after you had thus amused me, I know not how long, with your fine philosophy, all I retained of it was a multitude of barbarous and dark words, proper to bewilder, perplex, and tire out the best wits, and only invented the better to cover the vanity and ignorance of men like yourself, that would make us believe that they know all, and that under those obscure and ambiguous words are hid great mysteries which they alone are capable to understand. If you had seasoned me with that philosophy which formeth the mind to ratiocination, and insensibly accustoms it to be satisfied with nothing but solid reasons, if you had given me those excellent precepts and doctrines which raise the soul above the assaults of fortune, and reduce her to an unshakable and always equal temper, and permit her not to be lifted up by prosperity, nor debased by adversity, if you had taken care to give me the knowledge of what we are and what are the first principles of things, and had assisted me in forming in my mind a fit idea of the greatness of the universe, and of the admirable order and motion of the parts thereof. If, I say, you had instilled into me this kind of philosophy, I should think myself incomparably more obliged to you than Alexander was to his Aristotle, and believe it my duty to recompense you otherwise than he did him. Should you not, instead of your flattery, have taught me somewhat of that point so important to a king, which is, what the reciprocal duties are of a sovereign to his subjects and those of subjects to their sovereigns, and ought not you have to consider that one day I should be obliged with the sword to dispute my life and my crown with my brothers? Have you ever taken any care to make me learn what 'tis to besiege a town, or to set an army in array? For these things I am obliged to others, not at all to you. Go, and return to the village whence you are come, and let nobody know who you are, and what has become of you. 3. The Epics. The Mahabharata, its story, its form, the Bhagavad Gita, the metaphysics of war, the price of freedom, the Ramayana, a forest idol, the rape of Sita, the Hindu epics, and the Greek. The schools and the universities were only a part of the educational system of India. Since writing was less highly valued than in other civilizations, and oral instruction preserved and disseminated the nation's history and poetry, the habit of public recitation spread among the people the most precious portions of their cultural heritage. As nameless raconteurs among the Greeks transmitted and expanded the Iliad and the Odyssey, so the reciters and declaimers of India carried down from generation to generation and from court to people the ever-growing epics into which the Brahmans crowded their legendary lore. A Hindu scholar has rated the Mahabharata as the greatest work of imagination that Asia has produced, and Sir Charles Eliot has called it a greater poem than the Iliad. In one sense there is no doubt about the latter judgment. Beginning, circa 500 B.C., as a brief narrative poem of reasonable length, the Mahabharata took on with every century additional episodes and homilies, and absorbed the Bhagavad Gita as well as parts of the story of Rama, until at last it measured 107,000 octameter couplets, 7 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. The name of the author was Legion, Vyasa, to whom tradition assigns it, means the arranger. 100 poets wrote it, 1,000 singers molded it until, under the Gupta kings, circa 400 A.D., the Brahmins poured their own religious and moral ideas into a work originally Kshatriyan, and gave the poem the gigantic form in which we find it today. The central subject was not precisely adapted to religious instruction, for it told a tale of violence, gambling, and war. Book 1 presents the fair Shakuntala, destined to be the heroine of India's most famous drama, and her mighty son Bharata. From his loins come those great Bharata, Mahabharata, tribes, the Kurus and the Pandavas, whose bloody strife constitutes the oft-broken thread of the tale. Yudhishthira, king of the Pandavas, gambles away his wealth, his army, his kingdom, his brothers, at last his wife, Draupadi, in a game in which his Kuru enemy plays with loaded dice. By agreement, the Pandavas are to receive their kingdom back after enduring a 12-year banishment from their native soil. The 12 years pass, the Pandavas call upon the Kurus to restore their land, They receive no answer and declare war. Allies are brought in on either side until almost all northern India is engaged. References in the Vedas to certain characters of the Mahabharata indicate that the story of a great intertribal war in the 2nd millennium BC is fundamentally historical. The battle rages for 18 days and 5 books. All the Kurus are slain, and nearly all the Pandavas. The heroic Bhishma alone slays 100,000 men in 10 days. Altogether, the poet-statistician reports, the fallen numbered several 100 million men. Amid this bloody scene of death, Gandhari, queen consort of the blind Kuru king, Dhritarashtra, wails with horror at the sight of vultures hovering greedily over the corpse of Prince Duryodhan, her son. Stainless queen and stainless woman, ever righteous, ever good, stately in her mighty sorrow on the field Gandhari stood. Strewn with skulls and clotted tresses, darkened by the stream of gore, with the limbs of countless warriors is the red field covered o'er, and the long-drawn howl of jackals over the scene of carnage rings, and the vulture and the raven flap their dark and loathsome wings. Feasting on the blood of warriors, foul pishachas fill the air. Viewless forms of hungry rakshas, limb from limb the corpses tear. Through this scene of death and carnage was the ancient monarch led. Kuru dames with faltering footsteps stepped amidst the countless dead, and a piercing wail of anguish burst upon the echoing plain as they saw their sons or fathers, brothers, lords, amidst the slain, as they saw the wolves of jungle feed upon the destined prey, darksome wanderers of the midnight prowling in the light of day. Shriek of pain and wail of anguish o'er the ghastly field resound, and their feeble footsteps falter, and they sink upon the ground. Sense and life desert the mourners as they faint in common grief. Death-like swoon succeeding sorrow yields a moment's short relief. Then a mighty sigh of anguish from Gandhari's bosom broke. Gazing on her anguished daughters, unto Krishna thus she spoke. Mark, my unconsoled daughters, widowed queens of Kuru's house, wailing for their dear departed like the osprey for her spouse. How each cold and fading feature wakes in them a woman's love, how amidst the lifeless warriors still with restless steps they rove. Mothers hug their slaughtered children, all unconscious in their sleep. Widows bend upon their husbands, and in ceaseless sorrow weep. Thus to Krishna queen Gandhari strove her woeful thoughts to tell, when alas her wandering vision on her son Duryodhan fell. Sudden anguish smote her bosom, and her senses seemed to stray. Like a tree by tempest shaken, senseless on the earth she lay. Once again she waked in sorrow, once again she cast her eye where her son in blood empurpled slept beneath the open sky. And she clasped her dear Duryodhan, held him close unto her breast. Sobs convulsive shook her bosom as the lifeless form she pressed, and her tears like rains of summer fell and washed his noble head, decked with garlands still untarnished, graced with nishkas bright and red. "Mother," said my dear Duryodhan when he went into the war, "wish me joy and wish me triumph as I mount the battle car. Son," I said to dear Duryodhan, "heaven avert a cruel fate. Yato dharma stato jaya, triumph doth on virtue wait." But he set his heart on battle, by his valor wiped his sins. Now he dwells in realms celestial, which the faithful warrior wins. And I weep not for Duryodhan. Like a prince he fought and fell, but my sorrow-stricken husband, who can his misfortunes tell? Hear the loathsome cry of jackals, how the wolves their vigils keep. Maidens rich in song and beauty erst were wont to watch his sleep. Hark, the foul and blood-beaked vultures flap their wings upon the dead. Maidens waved their feathery pankas round Duryodhan's royal bed. Mark Duryodhan's noble widow, mother proud of Lakshman bold, queenly in her youth and beauty, like an altar of bright gold. Torn from husband's sweet embraces, from her son's entwining arms, doomed to lifelong woe and anguish in her youth and in her charms. Rend my hard and stony bosom crushed beneath this cruel pain. Should Gandhari live to witness noble son and grandson slain? Mark again Duryodhan's widow, how she hugs his gory head, how with gentle hands and tender softly holds him on his bed. How from dear departed husband turns she to her dearest son, and the teardrops of the mother choke the widow's bitter groan. Like the fibre of the lotus tender golden is her frame, O my lotus, O my daughter, Bharat's pride and Kuru's fame, if the truth resides in Vedas, brave Duryodhan dwells above. Wherefore linger we in sadness, severed from his cherished love? If the truth resides in Shastra, dwells in sky my hero's son, wherefore linger we in sorrow, since their earthly task is done? Upon this theme of love and battle 1,000 interpolations have been hung. The god Krishna interrupts the slaughter for a canto to discourse on the nobility of war and Krishna. The dying Bhishma postpones his death to expound the laws of caste, bequest, marriage, gifts, and funeral rites, to explain the philosophy of the Sankhya and the Upanishads, to narrate a mass of legends, traditions, and myths, and to lecture Yudhishthira at great length on the duties of a king. Dusty stretches of genealogy and geography, of theology and metaphysics separate the oases of drama and action. Fables and fairy tales, love stories, and lives of the saints contribute to give the Mahabharata a formlessness worse and a body of thought richer than can be found in either the Iliad or the Odyssey. What was evidently a Kshatriyan enthronement of action, heroism, and war becomes, in the hands of the Brahmins, a vehicle for teaching the people the laws of Manu, the principles of yoga, the precepts of morality, and the beauty of nirvana. The golden rule is expressed in many forms. Moral aphorisms of beauty and wisdom abound, and pretty stories of marital fidelity, Nala and Damayanti, Savitri, convey to women listeners the Brahman ideal of the faithful and patient wife. Embedded in the narrative of the great battle is the loftiest philosophical poem in the world's literature, the Bhagavad Gita, or Lord's Song. This is the New Testament of India, revered next to the Vedas themselves and used in the law courts like our Bible or the Koran for the administration of oaths. Wilhelm von Humboldt pronounced it the most beautiful, perhaps the only true philosophical song existing in any known tongue, perhaps the deepest and loftiest thing the world has to show. Sharing the anonymity that India, careless of the individual and the particular, wraps around her creations, the Gita comes to us without the author's name and without date. It may be as old as 400 BC or as young as 200 AD. The mise-en-scène of the poem is the battle between the Kurus and the Pandavas. The occasion is the reluctance of the Pandava warrior Arjuna to attack in mortal combat his own near relatives in the opposing force. To Lord Krishna, fighting by his side like some Homeric god, Arjuna speaks the philosophy of Gandhi and Christ. As I behold, come here to shed their common blood, yon concourse of our kin, my members fail, my tongue dries in my mouth. It is not good, O Keshav. Naught of good can spring from mutual slaughter. Lo, I hate triumph and domination, wealth and ease, thus sadly won. Alas, what victory can bring delight, Govinda? What rich spoils could profit? What rule recompense? What span of life itself seems sweet, bought with such blood? Thus if we slay kinsfolk and friends for love of earthly power, ahovat, what an evil fault it were. Better I deem it, if my kinsmen strike, to face them weaponless and bare my breast to shaft and spear, than answer blow with blow. Thereupon Krishna, whose divinity does not detract from his joy in battle, explains, with all the authority of a son of Vishnu, that according to the scriptures and the best orthodox opinion, it is meet and just to kill one's relatives in war. That Arjuna's duty is to follow the rules of his Kshatriya caste, to fight and slay with a good conscience and a good will, that after all only the body is slain, while the soul survives. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.